Just beyond the icy veil of your imagination, picture this. A land blanketed in white, the wind howling not with menace, but with the lazy persistence of a dog that wants in. It's morning, or as close to morning as it gets when the sun rises reluctantly at 8 a.m. and disappears again before tea. Welcome to early winter in the northern European settlements. Year. Well, somewhere between we don't have clocks and the chickens are frozen to the coop. The house, if you could call it that, was half underground, half above, and entirely surrounded by snow. It was made of sod, logs, or whatever could be stacked, tied, or begged off a neighbor who mysteriously left for the trading post last spring and never came back. Inside, the walls might be sweating with frozen breath or the occasional soot ghost, but it was home. At least, that's what folks said when they weren't openly crying about their toes. A typical morning began with the urgent matter of not freezing to death. Not dramatically, of course, but in the dignified, passive way of someone whose fire went out during the night and now must contemplate whether it's worth moving from the pile of goat fur blankets to relight it. Fingers numb, thoughts slow, the eldest member of the household might be nudged awake with a broom handle, muttering old prayers and older complaints. Then came porridge. Ah, yes, the eternal porridge. Thick enough to be a solid, bland enough to be spiritual. They made it from oats if they had them, barley if oats were gone, and if the situation was truly desperate, stale bread boiled with snow. But here's the trick. You kept the pot going, always. You never washed it. Not out of laziness, although let's be honest, laziness helped, but because the remaining porridge from yesterday was the starter culture for today. Like a sourdough starter, but sadder. It's entirely possible that some pots were never fully emptied for years. A magical mulch of grain and guilt. Speaking of keeping things going, the fire, the heart of the home, or more accurately, the lungs, liver, and kidneys. It cooked the porridge, melted snow into water, smoked the hams when there were hams, and occasionally set things aflame that weren't supposed to be. It smoked, crackled, and sometimes wheezed like a retired mule. But fire was everything. Families entrusted one child with keeping the coals through the night. Not the oldest or the wisest, but the lightest sleeper. A child who could wake at the subtlest flicker, at a sliver of birch bark, whisper a few wood sorcery words like, "Please work," and coax the glow back to life. Outside, the world was not so much quiet as muffled. Even the wolves stepped softly through the white. Snow crept into everything, building with an architect's patience. It danced on the roof, wormed through the windows, and tried to draft itself in as a paying tenant. Shoveling was less an act of clearing and more of carving a reminder that yes, these are still steps, and no, you may not park your sled wolf here. If you were a child in this frozen guest house of nature, playtime meant two things. Frostbitten games of run from the goose. Those birds remembered everything. And the godlike joy of finding your own breath in the air, only to catch it, fail, and then try again. Elders told stories, mostly of worse winters, because that's how elders validate their promotions. They described frost so thick birds had to knock twice before entering. Snow so deep you could sled off the roof and land in another region. Wolves so clever they'd file complaints with the town council. Clothing was practical. Layers upon layers of wool, leather, fur, and pure desperation. The fashion was less runway chic and more, well, it keeps the wind from gnawing my shins. Mittens were made from anything. Reindeer hide, dog fur, or on particularly cold days, borrowed neighbors' cats when available and consenting. Still, life endured. Through low sun, high drifts, and a diet that could starve a Renaissance painter for color. People trudged, scraped, salted, and occasionally laughed, mostly from the cold playing tricks on their brains. To survive winter back then wasn't a matter of gadgets or Gore-Tex. It was warm bread, a shared blanket, and the steadfast belief that spring couldn't possibly abandon them forever. And so, as another dusky mid-morning settles into thick snowy silence, you can almost hear the porridge bubble, the fire mumble, and the wind say, "Just checking in again." If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. The wind doesn't knock politely in early colonial cabins. It breaches. It seeps under doors and whispers rude things through the chinks between logs. Inside, an average settler's home was not so much a shelter as it was a spirited suggestion of one. Picture it, a wooden box, rough-hewn, not quite square, with a thatched roof attempting to sulk under 5 feet of snow. And within this drafty shoebox, a family of 7 slept like spoons in a drawer, wrapped in wool, homespun linen, and undiagnosed optimism. There was no thermostat to adjust, no flick of a switch to fix the frost that crept across the window panes. No, heat came from 2 sources: the hearth, which was perpetually stoking whatever could be coaxed into combustion, and livestock, yes, cows, pigs, and chickens, that were sometimes brought indoors. Not out of affection, mind you, but because letting your only cow freeze to death outside in January was considered a poor financial decision, and also inconvenient. Unlike modern homes designed with insulation, these cabins had little defense against the encroaching chill. Gaps between logs might be stuffed with moss, clay, or whatever wasn't actively on fire at the time, and families routinely awoke with frost on their blankets. But they considered it character building, and also just Tuesday. Most settlers greeted the dawn thanks not to gentle sunshine, but to the desperate chorus of a chicken exclaiming from the foot of the bed. Light streamed in through oiled paper windows because glass was only slightly less rare than polite porcupines, casting a filtered, tea-colored glow over the dwelling. If everyone was lucky, the fire had only mostly gone out overnight. If not, someone, usually the youngest child, or anyone not quick enough to pretend to be asleep, was sent to fetch more wood. Firewood was less a resource and more a lifestyle. Chopping, stacking, fetching, and crucially, not burning it all in one go was a winter-long endeavor. A family needed upwards of 30 cords to endure the season. And yes, that is roughly a mountain-sized quantity. Trees were no longer majestic parts of a sweeping landscape. They were simply tomorrow's fire, and the day after's sore back. Now, imagine preparing breakfast in these conditions. Your fingers are half frozen, your breath puffs in front of you, and you're trying to pour out cornmeal without also pouring out regret. Cornmeal mush, or hoe cake, if you happen to fry it on a flat stone, or later in bacon grease, was a breakfast staple. It could be eaten hot, cold, or aggressively indifferent, depending on how long it had been sitting near the hearth. Butter, if one had it, was a prized treasure stored somewhere between unimaginably cold and physically unreachable in a crock outside or buried beneath snow for safekeeping. Think of it as the early version of the refrigerator, with bears. Meat was preserved in salt or smoked in makeshift smokehouses, and vegetables, well, they weren't so much eaten in the winter as they were pondered wistfully. Root cellars offered humble bounty, wrinkled carrots, tired turnips, and potatoes that had seen better days. In October, children, if they weren't busy attending school in buildings only marginally warmer than the outdoors, spent their time engaged in helpful activities like spinning wool, churning butter, or repeatedly asking if spring was here yet. Toys were a luxury. A corn husk doll, a carved wooden animal, or, if you were very lucky, an icicle shaped like a duck could provide hours of highly chilled entertainment. Yet despite all this, there was laughter. There were stories by the fire, shadows flickering against log walls as tales of foxes, narrow escapes, and suspiciously talented raccoons danced in the flame light. Neighbors would share cider, sorrow, and songs. The kind of songs that didn't rhyme very well, but did involve a great deal of stomping and occasionally an out-of-tune fiddle. Evenings were wrapped in a hush. Outside, the snow blanketed the world in silence that was almost holy. Inside, the last orange embers curled upward as families tucked into bed, bundled like burritos in woolen layers, with hot stones or iron pans wrapped in cloth at their feet for warmth. Above, the stars blinked lazily, scattered across the winter sky, ancient markers of time and weather, and occasional scapegoats for why your butter froze to the crock again. And so the night stretched on, deep and slow, holding secrets in frost-covered corners, as another winter day shimmered into memory. In the hush and glow of the next quiet morning, we'll step outside, where the real challenges await beneath snow-drifted paths and unfamiliar footprints. By first frost, the settlers had rediscovered an ancient truth that previous generations had wisely never forgotten. Snow looks beautiful falling lightly on a pine branch. Less so when it's melting down your trousers during a latrine trip at midnight. The charm of winter wore thin quickly when one's mittens were frozen stiff from yesterday's soggy firewood and your neighbor had borrowed your last candle stub the week before. Inside their wooden dwellings, some barely more sophisticated than dampened crates, families huddled around feeble hearths, reenacting a domestic ballet of survival. The hearth was not just for warmth. It was the neighborhood's weatherman, coffee shop, and emergency dentist's waiting room all in one. The fire whispered the coming cold through its timbre. If the smoke curled low and lazy, warmer days were near. If it rocketed up the flue with a whistle, congratulations, you'd be sleeping with an extra blanket of frost on your mustache tonight. These homes, known affectionately as cabins, and less affectionately by their inhabitants as drafty wooden regrets, were feats of frontier compromise. Logs chinked with mud, moss, or in some desperate measures, frozen bread paste, stood defiant against the Arctic air, though often with all the resistance of a saucer made of cheesecloth. Windows, if they existed, were oiled parchment, wax paper, or a translucent, frost-kissed goodbye from people who once had glass. Daily life in winter meant recalibrating the idea of what constituted a successful morning. For example, waking up with all your toes still attached. Excellent. Water in the bucket not frozen all the way through. A luxury. If Grandma's knitting needles hadn't iced to the shawl again. A minor miracle. And if by some miracle someone had stored the chamber pot indoors, well then, today was practically a festival. Only the most essential of tasks were completed outside during the snow-choked months. Fetching water from the stream became a treacherous expedition, requiring bravery formerly reserved for fighting bears, or neighbors who returned your axe with a new notch. The stream would be sheathed in 2 feet of ice, and no matter how many times it was hacked open with an iron rod or a sharpened shovel, It froze faster than a town gossip after a scandal. Even storytelling, a beloved evening pastime, shifted in tone and tempo with the freeze. Gone were the long, embroidered tales of harvest festivals and maypole dances. Instead, grandparents leaned close to their young, breath-forming crystalline puffs, and offered softly spun legends about frost giants and blizzards that talked. Not out of whimsy, but because explaining the real causes of frostbite to a 5-year-old seemed rude, really. And then, of course, there was the food. Winter fare wasn't so much cooked as gently negotiated with. Root cellars, dug deeply beneath floors or nestled like secret bunkers near the house, hid precious carrots, wrinkled turnips, and suspiciously noble onions. Salted pork, which had spent the summer soaking in wooden barrels beside the family dog's curiosity, made up the core of daily protein. By February, most people could identify their neighbors by their sauerkraut aroma alone. Meals were less about enjoyment and more about physiology. Stew made 5 ways, potato in every form, boiled, mashed, regretted, and dried beans, beloved for their shelf life and cursed for their musicality, kept families alive and perfumed throughout those dark months. And yet, despite the shortages, the frostbitten toes, and the strange roaring noises the wind insisted on making every 3rd or 4th night, families persisted. Under scratchy quilts stitched from old breeches and dreams of summer, children slept soundly, occasionally waking to the sound of a parent stuffing a rag into a fresh crack in the wall, or coaxing reluctant embers from a log that never wanted to burn in the first place. Ingenuity thrived here, not always elegantly, but with the grim glee of people who had become experts in survival by sheer necessity. Warmth was a patchwork of methods, warming stones wrapped in burlap, bricks reheated in the fire and slid into beds like medieval hot water bottles, or the simply timeless art of stealing the dog spot. So, as the sky dropped another soft veil of snow, and the wind composed yet another unrequested lullaby against the shutters, these early settlers settled again into their bunks, hearts beating slowly beneath layers of wool, flannel, and familial stubbornness. Outside, the night spread wide, quiet, recursive. Soon, it would be time to rise before dawn, when another ritual of resilience awaited, a frosted prelude to the morning chore that no one ever wanted. Firewood. By late December, a hush settled over the settlement, not from peace, but from snow, which muffled every boot step and turned the world into a slow-moving painting in grayscale. Life did not stop, of course. No, the early colonists weren't blessed with hibernation instincts or magic fireplaces that stoked themselves. Winter was, in many ways, the grand examiner. It tested every decision made in summer and every nail driven into cabin walls during fall. And more often than not, the exam was given by a howling wind wearing an icicle mustache. Now, if you arrived in one of these early settlements and peeked inside a cabin, perhaps you'd expect a roaring hearth, fresh bread steaming on the table, and mittens drying on pegs. That's adorable and wrong. What you'd more likely find is smoke clinging to the ceiling like a lazy ghost, icicles forming on the inside of windows, and someone's timid attempt at soup, which was usually warmish water seasoned with regret and a potato peel. Wood was everything. Firewood was the currency of warmth, cooking, and not freezing into a settler-shaped ice sculpture. Colonists learned very quickly that you couldn't simply cut enough firewood for the winter and call it a day. There was never enough. And trees looked at the colonists with a kind of leafy smugness, swaying slowly as if to say, "Poor planning again." Chopping wood in December, you see, was both heroic and foolish. Heroic because only a brave soul would go out in minus whatever temperatures to hack frozen pine. Foolish because the frozen wood was tougher than a Puritan's opinion on dancing. Still, it had to be done, because fires dared to go out around 2:30 in the morning, just when your toes got cocky and thought they might warm up. Fire demanded attention, like a clingy cat, but with more combustion. Inside those sturdyish cabins, stacked walls of logs did their best to keep out the cold, but gaps and crevices had other plans. Early settlers stuffed moss, clay, and sometimes crumpled up pages from pamphlets about optimism into the cracks. It helped, a little, until wind threaded its way through anyhow, humming lullabies only the chilblains truly appreciated. Bedding was not luxurious. No one snuggled into a king-sized quilt stitched with the tears of angels. Blankets, if lucky, were inherited, woven from thick wool that held onto warmth, and every unpleasant smell that passed over it during the last 5 winters. People slept in shifts near the fire or spooned like they were trying to merge into one massive being for warmth. Privacy wasn't a winter concept. A family of 5 might sleep on the same floor mat, beneath a single layer of whatever fabric hadn't already been turned into someone's coat. And let's not even get started on going outside in the middle of the night. Say nature called, most likely in the harsh tone of beans making their usual mischief, and one had to trudge out to the privy. The path was dark, cold, slippery, and filled with the sort of existential dread usually reserved for philosophers. Some folks used chamber pots indoors, which were a romantic winter convenience, unless someone tripped in the dark, in which case the morning wake-up ritual involved soap, apologies, and more soap. As for food, winter heralded the great guessing game. Can I make stew from just turnips and passive aggression? Root cellars were the humble heroes, cold storage huts dug into the earth where cabbages sulked and carrots got surprisingly philosophical with time. Sometimes settlers would find a happy accident, a jar of berries preserved in the chaos of August. It would be divided ceremoniously, each person getting a tiny portion and chewing very slowly to make the sweetness last, approximately 5 seconds. Despite it all, despite the rations, the biting cold, the relentless maintenance required just to not perish, people laughed. Or at least they smirked with their eyes, since frozen cheeks didn't offer much mobility. They told stories around the hearth, letting imagination melt some of the frost off reality. Tales of foxes wearing spectacles or trees that whispered advice were passed around like dessert. After all, if hardship was certain, humor was the secret thread spun into daily survival. And so the long winter pressed on, day by snow-draped day, as the settlement braced itself for whatever came next. Perhaps, just maybe, with spring tucked somewhere ahead in the distance, beyond the trees, beyond the cold, past even the last frozen pickle in the cellar. By the time December's breath bit through the shutters of every lean-to and log cabin along the northeastern woodlands, early settlers had already made a kind of peace with discomfort. It didn't matter how many bearskin rugs you piled atop a dirt floor. Winter had opinions, and it wasn't shy about sharing them. The hearth, rough stacked with stones and blackened by months of hopeful fires, wasn't just the kitchen or the heating system. It was the town square, the therapist's office, and the major television network, all rolled into one smoky roar. Around this fire, people cooked, mended, gossiped, occasionally wept, and, on winter evenings when frost crept along the insides of the window panes, quietly imagined what palm trees might feel like. Cooking in winter required a monk's patience and a magician's optimism. Without green things to pluck or fresh animals roaming nearby, meals became increasingly beige. There was something that early New Englanders called winter stew, which was less of a recipe and more of a polite threat. It involved, on any given day, whatever hadn't gone mouldy yet, suspicious roots, and the ever-stalwart salted pork. If flavor was a distant cousin who'd moved out west, nourishment was the stubborn uncle who refused to leave until spring. Bread making became a spiritual exercise. Yeast, being a moody microorganism, went on winter strike. Dough had to be persuaded, cajoled near the hearth, wrapped in heavy cloths, sung to softly like a sulking cat. You'd think you were raising a child, not a loaf. Flatbread was both more forgiving and more widespread, as were a variety of gruels that answered the age-old question, what happens if you boil sadness with water? Still, ingenuity bloomed where sugar ran low. Dried apples might be simmered with maple sap, stolen in a sweet moment of culinary rebellion. Children unwrapped carefully stored cranberries as if they were rubies, their puckered taste a small party in the land of bland, and molasses, thick, dark, uncaring molasses, practically ran for mayor during winter. It smoothed over burnt porridge, livened dry cornbread, and distracted guests from the general scarcity of anything else. Clothing, meanwhile, followed the philosophy of quantity over elegance. Layering was key, so much so that on particularly frigid days, the average settler resembled a turnip wrapped in woven paradoxes. Wool atop linen, atop wool again, all stitched together with a desperation for warmth. Mittens were filled with fur or scraps of anything softish, a kind of wearable patchwork poetry. None of it made anyone particularly agile. Wintertime chores were a slow-motion ballet of bundled forms. People walked with the precision of penguins, lifted tools like cosmonauts, and had serious domestic disputes about who trailed that trail of snow chunks back indoors. Then there were the beds. Oh, the beds. Mattresses stuffed with straw huddled close to the fire, sometimes shared between 2 or 3 generations, and the occasional cat who'd snuck in, claiming squatters' rights. Iron warming pans, think early, unlicensed heating pads, were stuffed with coals and dragged across the sheets before bedtime. It was romantic in theory, terrifying in execution. No one wants to fall asleep wondering if their toes might spontaneously combust. Still, in that frozen hush of midwinter, there was an odd and glowing intimacy to it all. The world outside might be a canvas of icy indifference, but indoors beat the slow, sleepy heart of survival through shared heat and sweeter silence. Stories were told, not dramatic epics, but winding tales about wisps of hometown glory, strange dreams, and that one time Aunt Martha allegedly punched a goose. They laughed, quietly, often, but enough to warm the room, the way an ember winks when you've almost forgotten it. And so it went. The season passed not just with endurance, but with a kind of lumpy, smoky grace. For what is winter survival, if not a daring duet between human stubbornness and the absurd generosity of shared soup? Outside, the wind began to gather again, curling at the corners of doors and whispering of the next morning's freeze. Inside, sleepy heads leaned against wool-padded arms, fires flickered low, and someone carefully banked the coals, not with urgency, but with the gentle certainty that they'd need it again, come dawn. Just beyond that slumbering calm, another chapter of daily winter life tiptoes closer, quiet as falling snow. and just as full of hidden footprints. If you happen to wake up in a log cabin in the dead of winter, say sometime around 1693, your first order of business would be to not die. A modest goal, yet surprisingly time-consuming in the colonies. The floor might be frozen, your breath misting like a ghost from your mouth, and your nose acting like a snow detector, turning red before anything else can. And while the idea of a nice, slow morning might sound pleasant, it simply meant that your legs refused to function properly until you'd sat by the hearth for 15 minutes and absorbed enough radiant heat to avoid snapping like icicles. But let's talk about fire. Sweet, crackling, unreliable fire, the center of domestic life in early settlements, and the original subscription service, required daily maintenance and no refunds if it went out overnight. Since there were no matches, and flint was a finicky flirt in sub-zero air, many colonists spent part of every evening carefully banking the coals beneath ashes, hoping to resurrect them the next morning like little ember phoenixes. Of course, when that failed, and it often did, you'd tie on a coat stuffed with straw or whatever happened to be dead nearby, and trudge to the neighbors, hoping they had fire to spare. Borrowing fire was such a normal act that some settlements even designated an official fire watcher, a person whose sole duty was to keep flame alive in perpetuity. A noble job, if also a distinctly smoky one. Now, the early morning hours were the critical test. Would your water buckets have turned to solid ice? Almost certainly. Want to cook? You'll need to melt your ingredients first. Nothing says haute cuisine quite like boiling your breakfast. Bread took on the texture of pottery. Apples behaved like little frozen grenades. And you could knock a squirrel unconscious with a cabbage, should you be so inclined and sufficiently peckish. Speaking of peckish, food storage in winter was both a revelation and a terror. On the one hand, it was the only season where your meat locker was just outside. Hang it from the rafters or wedge it between some snowpacked stones, and voila, nature's freezer. On the other hand, said meat locker was also accessible to raccoons, bears, and one particularly irredeemable neighbor named Silas, who just wanted to borrow a ham Mary, calm down. To stay nourished, settlers turned to root vegetables so durable they could legally be defined as rocks. Turnips, parsnips, and rutabagas, foods that sound like they should be sneezes, were essential. Dried beans were a staple, and by mid-February, you were eating them not just for sustenance, but for emotional support. Lentils might be heart healthy, but more importantly, they didn't require you to go outside again. And yet, go outside you did. Chores, like guilt and laundry, did not pause for weather. Fetching wood was a daily ordeal, and one best approached strategically. Too early, and your fingers would take on the rigidity of antique door hinges. Too late, and you'd lose daylight. Either way, hauling frozen logs through waist-deep snow while wearing leather boots that laughed in the face of waterproofing was enough to make even the jolliest settler contemplate farming in the Bahamas. Washing clothes, meanwhile, invited feelings of either heroism or deep regret. With nowhere warm to dry them, you either wore slightly damp wool trousers for 3 days straight, or you hung them outside where they'd freeze into trousers-shaped sculptures. Functional art, if you will. And then there were the candles. Precious, handmade, fickle. Made from tallow, rendered animal fat. For those not versed in 17th century mood lighting, they emitted light, scent, and the occasional sputter that made you wonder if the house was haunted again. A wise household saved every stub, every scrap of wick, and sometimes even remelted the nubbins into mismatched votives that didn't so much as glow as they did participate. Still, by midday, if your fire held steady and no unseen horror stirred in the chimney, the household settled into a quiet rhythm. Soup warmed on the hearth. Someone mended a pair of mittens. A child, likely the youngest, was coaxed into checking the traps set days earlier because childhood was tough and raccoons were less aggressive in the cold, theoretically. And slowly, the house filled with the muffled sounds of daily life. Knitting needles tapping, a ladle scraping the side of a pot, someone muttering, "Where are my wool socks?" for the 7th time that week. Even in the most brutal winters, life persisted. Not comfortably or efficiently, but with a kind of stubborn grace. And just as the sun began its early descent behind frozen pines, the settlers turned again toward the hearth, ember keeping and soup stirring. Now, as we trace the drifting smoke curling past heavy beams, let us follow a different thread, one woven not in warmth, but in cold compromise, the fragile balance between tiny homes and vast wilderness. Out in the dim, frost-crusted dawn of early settlements, there was a sacred and bitter ritual, one performed not in chapels or forests, but in front of the fireplace, with flint, rock, desperation, and a small mountain of hope. Ah yes, fire-making, mankind's oldest chaotic romance. It was less, "Let there be light," and more, "Why is this bundle of twigs not catching for the 15th time today? And why is my left eyebrow noticeably shorter?" Morning in the depths of frontier winter didn't begin with roosters. Roosters were sensible animals and often refused to crow before the sun scraped through the dense frost glaze covering every window. Instead, settlers usually awoke to the sound of someone falling off a hay lump bed while whisper cursing about the cold. Comforters were few, mattresses more air than stuffing, and the air inside the cabin was only marginally warmer than the ice-coated world outside it. In those timeless pre-dawn moments, the cabin hearth became the most vital organ of a home. Without a fire, there was no warmth, no hot food, and quite possibly no fully functioning fingers by midday. Fire was life, and coaxing it into existence each morning was a matter of both skill and stubbornness. Flint and steel sparks flew with the kind of dramatic flair that would make any modern camping app blush. And sometimes that's all they did, just flew into the void. Tinder, usually a mix of dry moss, shredded bark, or the occasional miracle of something not moist, was guarded with the kind of fierce devotion one might apply to gold or a decent wool sock. And when the flame finally came to life, hissing and spitting into the kindling like a sleepy dragon begrudgingly stretching its wings, well, that was a triumph, a pre-coffee, pre-toast, early morning miracle. Once warmth began to spread its gentle fingers across the rough interior of the log cabin, the family stirred and shuffled into action. Of course, action might be a generous word. Anyone who's ever tried putting on frozen trousers in a room just below the meat locker temperatures knows that movement was slow, cautious, and punctuated with small yelps. Breakfast was a kindly affair, if not always an exciting one. The porridge, lumpy and often resembling wet gravel more than cuisine, was ladled out with the resigned love of someone who knew this particular dish had kept them alive all month. If luck had been on their frosty side, there might be a few slivers of apple, or even last summer's dried berries tossed in for drama. A handful of homes had root cellars tucked beneath the floor, but those were hardly luxury larders. If it had the word turnip in it, it was probably on the menu. Again, outside the world held its breath under a white hush that covered the land so completely Even rabbit tracks seemed like a form of whispering. Going out meant bravery, or at least thick mittens. That might mean fetching wood, checking on the livestock if they hadn't managed to stage a rebellion by freezing in place, or, heaven spare them, fetching water. Ah yes, water. One of the most crucial resources, and in winter, one of the most maddening. The buckets frozen solid, ice in the well bucket, stream crusted like sugar glass. Some settlers broke the surface with iron rods, others carefully carried embers to melt it just enough. Whatever the method, it proved the universal truth of the frontier. Water may give life, but it also takes toes. Clothing in winter was a practical form of theatre. Every layer told a story. Here's the wool shirt Grandpa wore when he came over from the old country. Here's a raccoon hat that may or may not still smell a bit like raccoon. Here's socks that don't even match each other, but are thick enough to pass as boots. Donning these garments was a group performance, with much applause or groaning whenever someone located both mittens on time. Despite how rigorous it all sounds, there was something quietly grand about those mornings. The way the sun slowly glinted across frost-dressed branches, how a single chimney's smoke felt like a victory puff from humanity itself. These settlers, wrapped in homespun wool and stubbornness, weren't just surviving. They were writing the footnotes of a world still in the making. Outside the cabin walls, nature stayed beautifully impartial. Snowfall glimmered like confetti at a wedding no one had invited humans to. A deer sometimes wandered past, unimpressed, and birds, shockingly cheery things for the time of year, chirped nonsense like feathered optimists of the apocalypse. But within the cabin, with fire murmuring and porridge bowls scraped clean, families turned to the day's labours. The next problem would probably involve livestock, or the snow on the roof, or possibly the neighbour's chimney smoke looking a little suspiciously absent. But those stories, thick as those homemade socks, begin with the turning of another flake-covered page. By deep midwinter, chores were no longer just chores. They were survival in wool-lined disguise. Each task, whether milking, chopping wood, or coaxing warmth from embers older than your boots, was imbued with a dramatic sense of importance. Take, for example, the matter of water. Water, in the heart of January, behaved like a stubborn, cantankerous aunt who once visited for the holidays and never left. Wells froze, buckets cracked, streams dozed beneath a sleepy blanket of ice. And yet, somehow, every settler still needed water for drinking, cooking, washing, or the occasional emergency dethaw of your only decent pair of socks. Fetching it wasn't so much a routine as it was a hero's pilgrimage. They'd wrap themselves in layers crafted less for elegance than for sheer brute resistance to hypothermia. Picture an onion. Now load that onion with wool, fur, more wool, a suspiciously scratchy scarf, and a hat that looked like it might have started life as a raccoon. That's your average water-fetching ensemble. Then out they trudge, shouldering the yoke. Yes, the actual wooden contraption that looks like something out of a Renaissance fair cosplay, but was, unfortunately, entirely serious. With two buckets swinging like pendulums of frost, they'd crunch through the snow toward the nearest water source, which was never just around the corner, despite what Uncle Ed insisted during the land survey. Many used the community well, if they were lucky enough to live near a settlement centre, rather than on the outer edges, where even the wolves muttered, "Bit drafty tonight." The well cover would be frozen shut, requiring creative solutions involving iron bars, pickaxes, and on one particularly inspired occasion, a heated frying pan on a rope. Once open, the well emitted a slow, mournful mist, as though even it was questioning your motives. Lowering the bucket demanded a steady hand and firm faith. Too fast, and you'd splash precious water. Too slow, and ice would creep in mid-descent, locking the rope with a smug shimmer. Carrying it back was a reverse obstacle course through snowdrifts and moody breezes. Some settlers would swing the buckets lightly to keep water from freezing. Others covered them with cloth. A few philosophical types just accepted that by the time they got home, they'd essentially be holding artisanal ice sculptures. Washing clothes was even worse, or should I say, rarer. Families often designated a single wash day every few weeks. Washing involved breaking ice off the river to reach the flowing water beneath, then scrubbing linen against a stone, while both your hands slowly transformed into stinging, trembling imitations of hands. Soap helped a little, but mostly with your mood, not your numb knuckles. Underclothes, in particular, were handled with a mix of shame, superstition, and optimism. "Don't worry," one settler might say, squinting at his snow-encrusted long johns. "If I beat them against this tree a few times, that'll count." It didn't, but no one argued, mostly because they, too, were wearing February's finest beneath their coats. Of course, in the crowded cabins, everything was a team effort, often unwillingly. It was hard to ignore your neighbor boiling socks if you shared a one-room house. Children would ask, "Is it soup?" Adults would sigh, "No, but close enough." Water was life, but it was also slippery, cold, and heavy, which makes you wonder why they didn't find a better way. The short answer, they couldn't. The long answer, they were too busy trying not to die. Even so, there were small moments of comfort. A steaming ladle of tea poured into a wooden cup. A splash of warm water used to clean a baby's face. Or the hissing magic of pouring frostbitten water onto a hot cobblestone, watching it vanish in an instant. Proof, perhaps, that warmth, however fleeting, could win. As the last ember dimmed in the hearth that night, and the water froze once more in its bucket, frozen solid with the quiet arrogance of winter, the settlers leaned back beneath their quilts of patch and resolve. Tomorrow's water would be no easier, but it would come, just the same. And as they slept, the frost outside danced quietly against the window panes, while inside, another humble miracle was beginning to rise. Breakfast. Eggs. Maybe. Porridge. Definitely. But how it got there, well, that's a story worth drifting into. By the time February staggered into the settlements like an exhausted relative who'd already overstayed their welcome, early colonists were settling into the daily ballet of keeping themselves, their livestock, and their eyebrows from freezing off. The snow had grown firmer underfoot, crunching like stale bread with each step, and the air had developed a sort of personality, sharp-witted, unsympathetic, and entirely uninterested in human warmth. But in spite of winter's best efforts, people endured. They had no choice and, more impressively, no thermostat. Let us step inside one of those squat, timber-framed homes, where smoke curls sluggishly. From the chimney, like it too, isn't particularly motivated. The fire inside crackled dutifully, albeit with the enthusiasm of damp firewood, a common companion. Oak and birch burned better when dry, of course, but seasoning wood took a year of planning, and unfortunately, good intentions didn't crackle nearly as well. The hearth was the center of the home, both practically and symbolically. It provided warmth, cooked meals, dried mittens, heated baths, which were mostly theoretical in February, and was a convenient location for dramatic size. Families huddled around it not so much for bonding, but survival. If love didn't keep you warm, at least the coals might. The day began before the sun decided to show up. Chickens, if not already frozen in their coop, were to be checked. Water had to be broken into with an axe. Yes, you heard correctly. A literal axe. Buckets left outdoors froze into shimmering monuments to poor planning, and wells often iced over like reluctant martyrs. Inside, mothers and daughters worked through the ritual of morning meal making. Bread from coarse, stone-ground flour was sliced and toasted by the fire. Butter, if available, had to be chipped from a near-frozen crock like culinary excavation. Preserves offered a hint of summer. Jars of bruised berries afloat in sugar syrup like a memory of a distant picnic. Breakfast was humble, but each bite contained layers of stories. Harvests barely made, storms narrowly dodged, and the names of family dogs no longer spoken of, mostly due to blizzards and poor visibility. Outside, life stiffened under a crust of snow. The men, and this was very much the era of men doing cold outdoor things, had to tend to livestock. Cows needed milking, and you haven't truly lived until you've tried milking a frostbitten cow that resents you. Horses and oxen had to be fed, their breath pluming into the air like displeased dragons. Chickens were rarely in a good mood, but winter was when they became particularly judgmental. Frozen egg problems were real, and early settlers had to learn that eggs laid in the morning could literally crack themselves open from the cold before noon. The result? Surprise omelets, but not the comforting kind. Children, when not pressed into service, that is, helping with water, wood, feeding, and complaining, found ways to amuse themselves. Sleds were rare, but any flat object could be repurposed with enough velocity and parental absence. Wooden shingles became racing sleds. Boards from the barn might vanish mysteriously and then reappear downhill hours later, accompanied by a red-cheeked child and an argument about borrowing. By mid-afternoon, the sky began turning its wintry shade of mauve, and temperatures dipped with a kind of passive-aggressive elegance. People rushed back inside, stomping snow off their boots and muttering things that wouldn't be considered polite in church. Supper was usually stews, thick, ongoing pots of whatever hadn't turned. Salt pork, turnips, barley. Sometimes a lucky rabbit found its way into the mix, met with whispered thanks and an unspoken agreement not to name the next one. The stew pot was rarely washed, which may alarm modern sensibilities, but this gave the stew character, also known as patina, seasoning, or let's be honest, laziness. Evenings were for mending clothes, telling stories, and fending off gloom. Entertainment came from one another. Little theatrical flourishes, tall tales, or the melodrama of someone accidentally stepping on the cat's tail again. Candles were precious, so when one was lit, everyone looked at it attentively, not because it was special, but because it was effectively their television. And yet, amid the cold and worry and cracked hands, there was a strange kind of peace. The fire flickered golden along the wooden beams. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees as if exchanging gossip with the moon. Inside, people huddled, tired, but still here, still hopeful. Snow settled on the thatched roofs like a quiet thought, and in the hush of winter night, the settlers exhaled. Not comfort, not certainty, but resilience in its coziest form. And as another brittle day clenched into darkness, the faint sound of iron on wood echoed from the barn, a hinge frozen past negotiation. Tomorrow would bring a particular kind of repair, and a rather inventive solution involving bacon grease. Snow had a way of rewriting everything. Come winter, the landscape surrounding an early colonial cabin became less a place and more an idea. Quiet, cold, seemingly endless, and all the better for it. Trees, in their skeletal patient poses, stood bundled in frost like elderly philosophers caught mid-thought, and the fields, now thoroughly disinterested in growing anything, offered only crunchy criticism beneath your boots. Inside, however, was the domain of domestic determination. Early settlers understood that the season ahead was going to be a slow-motion contest of wits between their own ability to prepare and the universe's commitment to trying them. And in this frostbitten arms race, the hearth was everything. The hearth, wide-mouthed, smoky, chaotic, was the nucleus of winter life, doubling as stove, heater, and reluctant light source. Flames snapped and hissed like they were gossiping about the day's attempts at survival, and small sparks occasionally leaped out to test whether your sock had lived too long. It often had. People would shuffle close to that wild, glowing heart of the home like tired moths, holding out their chilled fingers, rotating sides like rotisserie chickens, and hoping the heat might sneak a little deeper into stubborn joints and stoic bones. And behind every hearth, quite literally, was fuel, cut, split, stacked, and hoarded like currency. Firewood was not only essential, it was also immensely annoying. Gathering it in the fall was one thing, burning, through it by January, quite another. Try to imagine hauling frozen logs through thigh-deep snow, only to discover they're so full of moisture they sizzle like frying bacon and produce a smoke that seems personally offended by your lungs. It wasn't just inefficient, it was rude. Still, the art of fire maintenance was something of a badge of honor. Knowing how to nurse embers through the night, keeping a subtle glow alive under ashes so the next morning's rekindling didn't require a 3-hour wrestling match with frozen kindling. This was the kind of low-key domestic mastery that kept lives intact, or at least fingers. And then there was insulation, the gentle lie that your home was somehow separate from the world outside. Many early cabins were built with chinks between the logs, filled with, well, whatever refused to fall out. Clay, moss, animal hair, mud, and prayers mostly. Drafts would slip ghost-like through every ambition of the wall, stroking one's neck like a passive-aggressive aunt. It was said that some early settlers slept with their heads under the covers, not just to stay warm, but to avoid direct eye contact with the wind. Clothing, naturally, became one second cabin. Thick, linsey-woolsey trousers, endless layers of homespun, scratchy woolen socks, maybe a fur cap so large it gently suggested you were being eaten by a kindly woodland bear. These garments were not flattering. No portraits were painted in winter for good reason. But if your outfit rustled like a hay bale and added 10 pounds to each limb, congratulations, fashion was now functional. Let us not overlook the homely miracles of foot and hand warmers. Grandma's bedpan might double as a sleek, albeit slightly alarming, hand heater by day. Brick wrapped in rag was a premium bedtime accessory. Passing such a heated object under the quilt before crawling in felt like preparing for battle. If the battle was against your own mattress's glacial intentions. And then, of course, there was winter food. This was not the time of year for culinary exploration. Beans, dried apples, salted meats, and broth thick enough to stand your spoon in. These were the staples of the season. Meals were warm, filling, and suspiciously beige. But in their own way, they were comforting. Not fancy, certainly, but dependable, like a loyal pet or a well-oiled hinge. Each homespun detail of the winter months revealed not only adaptation, but improvisation, a slow, delicious blend of stubbornness and ingenuity. The settlers didn't just survive the cold. They wrestled it into an uneasy truce, one stew at a time. And as another snow-crusted evening took hold outside the frost-blurred windows, the family would gather close again. Lanterns flickered, shadows danced, and someone, usually the youngest, always the squirmiest, would ask, voice muffled beneath a hand-stitched quilt, "What did people do before chimneys?" Ah, that is a fire-breathing tale of its own. By the time the frost had claimed its annual dominion over the longhouses and hearthstones of early settlements, cooking had become less a matter of taste and more a test of innovation, optimism, and whether anyone had dropped a turnip behind the fire pit 3 weeks ago and forgotten about it. In the steely grip of winter, fresh ingredients transformed into legendary artifacts. A single onion could elicit gasps. A knob of butter, well, that was considered currency, medicine, and church, offering all rolled into one. So in lieu of decadent feasts, our resilient ancestors turned to soups and stews, those brothy banquets of dreaming and desperation. The backbone of these meals was often the humble so-called perpetual stew, a bubbly pot that never truly emptied, like a sourdough starter with ambitions, perched atop the hearth for weeks, or in more determined households, months. It was refilled endlessly with whatever ingredients stumbled in. The heel of stale bread, scrapings of salted pork, a half-hypnotized carrot. Stirring the stew was both an act of nourishment and a Sisyphean performance art, somewhere between preserving family tradition and just trying not to burn the bottom. By midwinter, the stew pot acquired a certain personality. Each ladleful was a time capsule, a flavorful memory of meals past. One unlucky slurp might unveil a murky reminder of the family cat's ill-fated pigeon hunt in December, while another might delight with a hint of parsnip from a long-forgotten January market day. And still, it was warm, it filled the stomach, and critically, it kept the bread from seeming quite so judgmental. Meals were often served in wooden bowls, whose surfaces bore the battle scars of previous winters. Forks were rare enough to be considered almost aristocratic, and most folks brandished spoons or simply made enthusiastic use of their fingers. Manners, much like salt, were seasonally variable and largely optional. Morning meals, or breakfast, depending on how optimistic one was about the day, were often simple. A porridge of oats or barley cooked in water if you had it, or just snow if you didn't, offered warmth and a bit of chewiness that gave one the illusion of purpose. If fortune had smiled and someone had traded socks for honey, then mornings could be decadently sweet. But most often, the flavor came courtesy of smoke from the hearth and whatever memory your mouth could conjure from last summer's berries. Sometimes, in the depths of winter, settlers would find themselves preparing and eating what was known, with grim affection, as hungry soup. Not because it made you feel hungry, but because it was made during times when everyone already was. Into the cauldron went roots that had gone soft, bark shavings, dried leaves, and dreams. Occasionally, winter birds were trapped and added. The result always tasted earnest, if not exactly delicious. And let's not forget that monumental culinary trial, keeping water liquid, a humble goal, yet a Herculean feat. In households where firewood was being strictly rationed, the kettle and its layer of morning ice became a recurring character in daily life. Water had to be melted, then warmed, then protected like the last marshmallow in the universe. You didn't just drink water, you earned it, you befriended it, you made it feel welcome. Baking was reserved for special days, when the woodpile was generous and spirits could be coaxed into rising, much like the rather short-tempered does of the time. Bread was dense, dark, and often doubled as a useful doorstop when stale. Yet nothing lifted a frozen household quite like the scent of rye and grain rising above the smoke. In that brief aromatic moment, winter seemed less cruel. Food preparation doubled as social ritual, creative exercise, and bargaining chip. Those who'd grown adept at fermenting, either vegetables or gossip, were prized members of the frozen community. A well-timed sauerkraut or slab of salted pickled herring could secure everything from candle stubs to gratitude sermons. And always the ever-hovering threat, spoilage. Not from heat, mind you, but from cunning mice, ravenous raccoons, or the sheer inability to remember what corner of the cabin you buried the smoked sausages in last November. Entire meals were occasionally unearthed accidentally during midwinter cleaning sprees, equal parts horrifying and thrilling. So much of a settler's winter day orbited food, storing it, stretching it, flavoring it optimistically, and recounting summer peaches with the kind of wistful detail usually reserved for poetry. Tomorrow, we'll see what happened in the heart of the long nights, when stories, rather than suppers, filled the space around the fire. By the time the sun finally peeked over the horizon in mid-morning, its light wan and apologetic, like someone arriving late to a funeral. The settlers had already been at it for hours. You see, in a winter that lasted half the year, in a place where the world itself seemed to creak and groan under the weight of snow-draped silence, time was more than precious. It was something you wrung out of the frozen rag of the day. And one vital chore, humble but mighty, was fetching water. Now, this might sound like a minor detail, the kind you'd gloss over in a history textbook on your way to revolutions and political intrigue. But trust me, in a frontier winter, water was everything. The irony, of course, was that the world was utterly full of the stuff, just in a somewhat inconvenient rock-solid format. Buckets, useless. Wells, froze right to the bottom. Open streams, dream on, unless you felt like tunneling down through layers of ice with what was essentially a very determined spoon. Fetching water was an endurance sport. The appointed family member, often the eldest child, because what better way to teach character than to make a 12-year-old plod through waist-deep snow with a sloshing iron pail, would bundle into layer after itchy layer, wool, homespun, old fur, anything they could find that didn't crack like parchment from the cold. Out they'd go, the landscape eerily quiet, save for the squeaking crunch of boots on snow and the occasional raven, who, despite all logic, continued to haunt this frozen purgatory, like it was paid to. The settlers often ventured to a designated hole in the nearest frozen creek, cut and guarded with an almost religious dedication. It had to be protected from refreezing marauding animals, and of course, the great threat of laziness. The process? Hack through ice, break up the slush, scoop the water. Try not to drop the bucket because it's metal, and your gloves are made from sorrow and string. Then trudge back, both arms stretched stiff, steam rising from the bucket, like it was carrying the breath of the earth itself. Inside the cabin, that water did everything. It was boiled for tea made from pine needles, surprisingly zesty, alarmingly pine-flavored. It moistened hardtack. It thawed feet. It was the unsung hero of winter hygiene routines, assuming, of course, that hygiene was even attempted that week. But let's not romanticize it too much. The water didn't stay warm for long. The indoor air was tolerably above freezing only within kissing distance of the hearth. Move 10 feet away, and you might as well be outdoors, except indoors was smaller and everyone smelled like smoked bacon and wet wool. Still, the simple act of boiling water felt luxurious by February. Watching the steam rise from a crusted kettle was strangely hypnotic. The hissing and bubbling became a kind of lullaby, rhythmic and reassuring, like the earth reminding you that under all this frostbitten grumpiness, something was still living, still hopeful. Sometimes, just for fun, or what counted as fun, in a settlement where half the children had never even seen a spoon that wasn't carved from driftwood, they'd pour the hot water into a cup and fling it into the air outside. If the cold was bitter enough, and spoiler, it usually was, it would vaporize mid-flight in a snowy cloud of science and delight. Nothing says pioneer party trick like reenacting the laws of thermodynamics during breakfast. And perhaps there was a deeper meaning in that moment, in making the invisible visible, in watching water become mist, mist become frost, and frost become part of the landscape again. A tiny, ephemeral miracle performed between chores and chilblains. At night, they'd repeat the ritual for evening tea, something vaguely medicinal, brewed with bark, or dried something or other that cousin Josiah swore cured melancholy. Bundled in layers, seated near a glowing hearth, sipping warm ladlefuls from mismatched mugs, they might allow themselves to believe that spring was not a tale told by madmen. Water, just water, colorless, flavorless, heavier than it looks, but it carried them through. Tomorrow's dawn would bring the same labor, the same crunch of boots, the same complaint about the ice axe going dull again. But for now, the home flickered with candlelight. Somewhere water was boiling, and somewhere further off, a creek lay sleeping under 3 feet of snow, waiting for dawn. Perhaps it's time we stoke the flames a little higher and tiptoe toward another survival secret, this one wrapped in wool and stitched with love. By the time January curled its frosty fingers around the cabins of the early settlers, even the squirrels had settled their affairs and opted for a long nap. The snow lay in thick, unhurried drifts, and the trees, those silent sentinels of winter, stood cloaked in ice like dignified old men with stiff collars and nowhere in particular to be. Everything moved slower, including thoughts, tongues, and the butter churn. But not chores, of course. Chores never got the memo about winter rest. Life in these frigid months was the delicate art of not freezing to death, while looking moderately dignified doing it. That started, above all, with firewood. Glorious, splintery firewood. Every settler was acutely aware that running out of firewood was not merely inconvenient, it was a genuine flirtation with the afterlife. They'd stack it high, sometimes seeing entire cabins flanked by walls of logs so neatly packed, you'd think the family was preparing for the timber-themed apocalypse. Inside the cabins, fireplaces roared like the beating heart of the home. If you've never seen a colonial hearth in winter, picture a blackened brick monster wide enough to roast a whole hog and still have room for a few stray boots drying next to it. And indeed, drying things was a full-time winter sport. Mittens, wool stockings, damp trousers, and occasionally the neighbor's dog, who insisted on playing in the degenerate piles of snow outside. To keep warm at night, families would huddle together with an assortment of bedfellows that included geese-down quilts, heated bricks wrapped in linen, and the occasional child strategically placed between adult bodies like a very sleepy, occasionally snoring insulation log. It wasn't exactly cozy in the modern sense, but it kept the frostbite at bay and offered a nightly game called Who's Hogging the Covers This Time? But winter wasn't all gloom and groans. there was a strange, frosted rhythm to it, a quiet charm woven through the scratchy wool of each day. With fields buried and tools too cold to hold, some duties paused just long enough to allow. Hobbies. Yes, once the basics of life were secured for the day, the settlers dabbled in pleasures both peculiar and quaint. One might carve spoons, another might attempt whistle-making to questionable musical effect, and others, liberated briefly from endless outdoor toil, would take to knitting with the fierce determination of someone who had once run out of mittens in January and vowed to never suffer such indignity again. It was also prime time for storytelling, with families exchanging tales passed down from older generations, many of which included suspiciously edited interactions with bears. Schooling, where available, didn't pause. In regions lucky enough to have a schoolhouse, or more often, a single-room dwelling with an underpaid and over-freezing teacher, children would trudge through snow, often in pairs for warmth and general safety from wolf-related mishaps. Slates would fog, ink might freeze, but knowledge, like a sneeze during prayer, always found a way. Of course, there was also the matter of keeping food from turning into brittle artifacts of dining. Cellars beneath the homes, packed tight with root vegetables and salted meats, were both miracle and menace. Go fetch a turnip could easily turn into a half-hour expedition involving creaky ladders, frozen breath, and a grudging respect for parsnips' ability to resemble rocks in poor lighting. Meat preservation during the winter months brought with it one of history's quieter miracles. Ice boxes that predated refrigerators by about a century and a half. With careful insulation and a few well-placed snow-packed crates, settlers turned November's slaughtered pig into an ongoing February supper guest. Sausages dangled like festive garlands across rafters, salted hams hung suspended in an eerie trottery limbo, and dried herbs whispered their grassy secrets from beams above. Outside, the world sparkled in its hush. Though harsh and unforgiving, winter had a beauty so absolute it seemed carved from crystal dreams. Icicles grew like silver fangs. Footpaths crunched like symphonies of frost. And through it all, the sky remained a pale pewter ceiling, hanging just above a world paused, as if the land itself was exhaling. And so, the settlers carried on, bundled against the biting cold, hearts warmed by the embers of fire and familiarity. Even in the bitterest months, they found moments to laugh, to carve, to sing slightly off-key around a fire, and to dream of spring with a longing that made even a budding weed seem like a miracle. As the crackling hearth quieted and the snow outside whispered softly against shuttered windows, another winter day melted into warm shadows, leading us gently into the next soft hush of life's frozen rhythm. Snowflakes fell like parchment ash, delicate and all too fleeting, vanishing the moment they touched the skin. In the heart of winter, when the sun became a shy guest, appearing reluctantly and scurrying off before supper, record-keeping in early settlements faced a unique sort of frostbitten dilemma. You see, humans, in all their sweaty brilliance, decided in the 17th century that survival wasn't quite enough. No, they wanted their grandchildren to know what kind of tallow they used for candles, who borrowed whose yoke, and, most thrilling of all, how many turnips were stored in the root cellar on the 17th of January. And so, even as their ink froze mid-sentence and their noses ran uninvited marathons, they wrote. Writing in winter required more than just determination. It required fingers that hadn't turned into stiff sausages and ink that didn't resemble a sad raisin floating in vinegar. Most settlers made their ink from a blend of leftover iron or soot, tree galls, and what can only be described technically as whatever hasn't frozen or fermented. Paper was hoarded like gossip in a small village. One did not simply scribble willy-nilly. Receipts were written in tiny crammed script that would make a modern tax auditor weep from eye strain. If someone wished to keep a journal, they'd better have a plan for keeping it and their hands warm, usually involving wrapping the whole operation in wool, tucking it into their coat, and writing only when the livestock allowed a quiet moment, which was rare, especially if goats were involved. Many settlers took to writing at night, huddled by the fire, the flicker of flames casting long shadows over the page. The moments were peaceful, contemplative, and regularly interrupted by the sputter of pine sap crackling in the logs. The scratch of quill on parchment might be accompanied by the distant howl of a lonely winter wind, or the much more immediate sneeze of someone attempting to invent tissues using corn husks. The importance placed on these winter writings cannot be overstated. They weren't just logs or letters, they were lifelines, planning the spring sowing, anticipating food stores, recording birth and death with an ink-stained earnestness. Even disputes, Jebediah took my sled without asking, became part of the record. Just imagine yelling about someone's sled snatching skills while wearing 14 layers and writing it down so future archaeologists could shake their heads sympathetically. There were, of course, the letter writers, long-distance communication heroes of the snowbound age, in towns with shared mailbags and a single traveller willing to brave snowdrifts taller than their horse. Letters often doubled as local newsletters. A single missive might contain news for 5 different households, updates from a cousin in a different colony, and 10 progressively frostier requests for a better pair of boots. Surprisingly, or perhaps not, given the state of romance during a time when people married mostly to survive winter, the most carefully penned letters were often love letters. They were rarely passionate. More often, they included lines like, "My dearest Mary, your last batch of dried apples was appreciated," or "I long for the warmth of your stew more than the hearth itself." Courtship was a practical affair, conducted with charm, ink, and a shared understanding that whoever owned the wool socks was in charge. Then there were the community decisions, minutes of town meetings conducted by candlelight, debated over mugs of something vaguely alcoholic, and recorded in handwriting so cramped it looked like the paper had sprouted ants. Votes were taken by voice or by pebbles placed in a hat, followed by a quick jot to record decisions about fence disputes and pig roaming rights. It's comforting to know that in the dead of winter, amid the squeaky snow and the brittle chill, communities paused to document their days, not because they thought we'd someday be reading them from the comfort of our memory foam mattresses, but simply because they wanted to be remembered. Every little note tucked between the frost-stiffened pages carried a small flame of humanity, of love, of routine, of pig-related indignation. And as the hearth crackled softly, ink dried beside frozen panes, and sleepy eyes blinked under knitted caps, history was quietly written, line by careful line. And slowly, just as the coals in the hearth whispered their final sighs of heat, morning's faint glow began to stretch across snowy fields. A new day, which meant time to bundle up and haul water, of course, but also time, perhaps, for a mug of something warm, and maybe a few words scribbled before the ink turned stiff again. The wind outside the wooden walls howled like a lonely wolf composing poetry, long and dramatic and mostly rhymeless. Inside, though, the settlers were beginning to master the art of staying warm with a stubbornness that bordered on performance art. In the absence of electric blankets and hot cocoa mix, survival by ingenuity became the unofficial winter sport, somewhere between snowshoeing and not dying. Let us step inside a small colonial home, perhaps in New England, where winter had a particular flair for the dramatic. The hearth was the heart of it all, the original home entertainment system. Forget Netflix. With a fire, you got warmth, light, occasional sparks, and, if your stew boiled over, a jump scare. It was also the kitchen, the drying rack, the heater, and rather unfortunately, where people stored their lard in hopes it wouldn't freeze solid as a brick and become a meat-based paperweight. The residents layered not just their clothing, but their chores. Getting through winter meant economy of movement. If you had to go outside to fetch firewood, you might as well feed the chickens, check the trap lines, and swing an axe at something, ideally wood, before returning inside looking like a frosty ghost and dragging in a half-dozen snowdrifts on your boots. Clothing was less fashion, more fortification. Wool upon wool, linen undergarments topped with homespun, everything. Mittens were often connected by strings threaded through the sleeves, which made early settlers the original inventors of wearable tech. And those odd little caps people wore to bed, entirely utilitarian. Heat escapes the head with ruthless efficiency, and in a drafty cabin, a nightcap was the line between a decent night's sleep and waking up with frostbitten earlobes that could snap off like twiglets. Bedding was no better. Settlers usually slept two or more to a bed, not just for familial affection, but for dear, sweet bodily heat. Siblings who fought in summer cuddled through winter like sleepy raccoons. Beneath layers of blankets, quilts, possibly some hide or fur, they burrowed into the night like hibernating logic puzzles. To keep the livestock alive, warm, and preferably not frozen upright in the pasture, many settlers brought their animals indoors. Yes, that's right. You, your cousin, and a damp goat, all coexisting in a candle smoke-scented harmony. Imagine waking to a rooster crowing at the chamber pot and a pig rolling over mid-dream. It was less a home and more of a furry, snoring ecosystem. Even water posed a challenge. Buckets left overnight would freeze solid. Frost formed on windows that didn't yet exist. Glass was rare and precious. Instead, oiled parchment or thin animal horn served as rudimentary panes, and still managed to let in cold drafts. That could have filed eviction paperwork against your toes. Food, of course, was the long chess game of winter. Everything had to be preserved before the snow flew. Smoked, salted, pickled, dried, or stored deep in the root cellar. A chilly underworld that existed somewhere between pantry, bunker, and very slow treasure chest. Settlers debated which root vegetables could best survive early frosts, and who was brave enough to venture down to retrieve them after dark. There were folk tales about things that lurked in the cellar. Most of them were probably just potatoes. Even with foresight, the winter menu lacked variety. A stew of salted pork and turnip could stretch a fortnight, though by night 9, people dreamed of being menaced by a cabbage just for the novelty. Coffee was rare. Tea, if you had it, was reused. The third steeping tasted like someone whispered leaves without making eye contact. Still, with all this, nights weren't joyless. There were stories around the fire, songs shared in low voices, mending done by flickering candlelight. A sock darned by hand, a patch on a shirt, were labours of care. Winter, for all its bite and its bitter, was also time made slow, and slow time was a kind of gift. Outside, snow blanketed the land, silent and deep. A powdery hush covered the open fields and narrow paths. Inside, the family curled beneath quilts, breath rising in soft clouds, candle stub wavering. and just beside the fire, the old dog twitching in sleep, chasing dreams of spring. Tomorrow would bring new chores, of course, a jammed flue, frozen door hinges, or chasing a rebellious chicken who had misunderstood the concept of community lodging. But for now, warmth shared was warmth multiplied, and in that quiet stretch between midnight and dawn, winter tucked its sharpness away. Let's listen in as the embers settle low, and think gently about what secrets might lie frozen just beyond the frost-blown barn. It was the kind of winter evening when the moon hung lazy and dish-shaped above the tree line, and everything hummed with an exhausted stillness, as though even the snowflakes had grown tired of falling. Inside a cramped settler's cabin, hastily buttressed against the endless ice, the clatter of wooden spoons and muffled sighs of digestion murmured the tale of supper, such as it was. Food in a harsh winter, after all, was less about flavour and more about not dying. The meal had likely consisted of something cheerfully described as stew, though its contents might generously be counted as liquid optimism with an undertone of desperation. Frozen rutabagas, the last sullen carrot, perhaps a strip of dried venison someone had been hiding in their sock drawer. Just enough to convince your stomach that, yes, something had happened. But even this was a triumph, born not from abundance, but from preservation. And oh, the icy chemistry of it all. Early settlers became reluctant alchemists, driven to master that most miraculous of arts, keeping things from rotting. Preserving food in the deep freeze of a pre-refrigerated existence was part necessity, part dark magic. Ice cellars dug deep into the earth became vaults of edible treasure. Meats were salted until they resembled well-wrapped regrets, and root vegetables were tucked into bins of sand to sleep away the season like overpriced produce on a spa vacation. Meanwhile, jars of jam sat in rows like smug little trophies, their contents having been boiled within an inch of their fruity lives the summer before. The sugar levels could melt a horse's molar, but in a land where calories were king and fruit was a whispered memory, no one complained. That said, taste was relative. When your daily choices boiled down to warmed over turnips versus last month's mystery jerky, your standards quietly stepped outside and didn't come back. What settlers lacked in culinary glamour, they made up for with sheer ingenuity, and particularly with a fondness for what modern diets would consider creative. Take bone tea, for instance, a fine winter delicacy that involved boiling scrap bones until the resulting liquid took on a greyish, ghostly hue and the faint perfume of a haunted butcher's shop. Sipped slowly and solemnly, it was thought to provide strength, warmth, and if not satisfaction, then at least reassurance that you were doing something. And then there was the pancake protocol. Griddles and frying pans, kept by the stove's edge, were not merely tools but cherished allies. Fat was hoarded like contraband gold, and flour was measured with ceremonial reverence. Pancakes, or their flatter, tougher cousins, were often leaned upon as vehicles for syrup, or more often, molasses, which was cheaper, stickier, and at times so thick it was nearly a moral decision just to eat it. Children learned early to appreciate a good dry biscuit, and adults leaned heavily on the psychological benefits of chewing something for 30 minutes to distract from winter's less charming effects. But most poignant of all, perhaps, was the ritual of sharing, the way food, however meager, became a communion of survival. Settlers learned to portion evenly, to hide favoritism, to offer the last piece of cornbread even if it made your heart weep, because in that snow-locked world, no one forgot how easily hunger made a man quiet. and how warmth wasn't just a matter of heat, but of hearts sharing the same dim hope in the same small room. Some nights, if they were lucky, a neighbor might bring over a jar of pickled beets or a small wedge of hard cheese as a gesture of goodwill, or perhaps as a subtle barter for news, or help mending a fence frozen in place since November. And on evenings like this one, the fire might burn just long enough, the stew might stretch just far enough, and the wind might hesitate just slightly outside the door, as if even the chill could respect a family finding comfort in lean quarters. All agreed without speaking. It was not a feast, but it was, in its way, enough. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, frozen wells, stiff tools, and the lingering hope for eggs from chickens that had grown deeply passive-aggressive in the cold. But tonight, bellies were coated in broth, cheeks glowed from the hearth, and beyond the cabin walls, the stars blinked sleepily, distant and untroubled. And somewhere in that ancient hush, a new kind of pressure was gathering. Not from the sky above, but from the snow itself, piling higher, drifting deeper, shaping the very world settlers walked in. A world that, once frozen into place, would teach its own slow, silent lessons. Let's take a gentle step into that snowdrift together. As winter thickened its grip on the frozen settlements, the days shortened like overworked candle stubs, and time itself took on a sleepy, slow-motion quality. Existence became less about living and more about avoiding death creatively. The colonial hearth, once a warm-hearted symbol of family life and burnt porridge, now became mission control. A fire wasn't just comforting. It was a matter of continuing to breathe without icicles forming on your upper lip. But keeping that fire going wasn't as simple as tossing on a few logs with poetic flair. Wood had to be cut, split, dried, then dragged through snowdrifts deeper than your uncle's tall tales. And nothing inspires family bonding quite like a collectively shared hypothermic wood-fetching misery. Men, women, and occasionally very sturdy children took turns with the axe, developing forearms that could both chop timber and intimidate bears, though neither was particularly advisable. Axes weren't infinite either. If a blade dulled, resharpening it took time and a grindstone, both of which ran out far faster than complaints. But beyond the fire, the literal beating heart of the household was the quiet, tireless contest against food scarcity. In modern terms, the winter pantry would resemble the back corner of a convenience store after a snowstorm. Too much molasses, suspiciously dry beans, and not nearly enough chocolate. For early settlers, though, dried goods were the bulk of winter meals: salt pork, dried peas, biscuits so hard they filed your teeth down mid-chew. Refrigeration was, of course, generously provided by Mother Nature, free of charge and with no off switch. Food was stored in root cellars, which were neither rooted nor particularly cellar-like, but have functioned rather like nature's own walk-in freezer. They often held turnips, cabbages, parsnips, and more turnips, because no one ever learns the first time. To stretch their limited supplies, the settlers cooked thoughtfully, and I use that word generously. Winter stews were a common solution. Throw what you have into a pot, let time and hope do the rest. A bit of salted meat, a wrinkled potato, and the faint memory of an onion could be simmered into something almost edible. By the end of March, even the most imaginative cookbooks reduced every recipe to 3 instructions. Add water, apologize, serve. Now, let's not forget water. Deceptively simple to modern eyes. The luxury of flowing taps hadn't yet graced these remote snowscapes. Water had to be fetched from streams, springs, or wells, most of which were frozen or moody. Fetching water in winter was a gamble. The bucket might crack, ankles could twist, and the occasional wolf was known to drop by, probably to borrow a cup of sugar and contemplate light mauling. Inside the home, water was stored in barrels or clay jugs near the hearth to keep it liquid adjacent, but they still froze sometimes. And so began the daily tradition of gently smashing ice with a ladle, muttering colonial curse words like fig jam or blast it with admirable restraint. Hygiene took an understandable backseat during these frosty months. Baths were rare, lest someone catch a chill, and stay chilly forever. Most folks employed the seasonal technique of a quick wipe and a longer prayer. You truly hadn't known the frontier spirit until you tried brushing your teeth with a straw, some salt, and the disappointment of winter breath. Yet, despite this frosty, bureaucratic nightmare of trying to stay alive, spirits remained surprisingly high. Humans, it seems, can find joy in even the muddy slush of hardship. Music crept into the evening, with fiddles pulled from hiding and voices raised in songs about potatoes, or songs that simply featured potatoes because rhyming with turnip is historically difficult. And amidst this unlikely cheer, there were games. Not digital distractions, but the old-fashioned kind, involving knuckles, wooden toys, and a penchant for making the best out of minimal resources. Children rolled hoops indoors, chasing them precariously near furniture. Adults played games like drafts or... I spy with my frostbitten eye. The longest-running game was who can sit closest to the fire without combusting. A contest taken very seriously by cats, dogs, and that one uncle who always claimed the warmest spot first. Some nights brought storytelling, ghost tales, folk legends, and tall tales so exaggerated they'd grown antlers. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were the insulation for the soul, warming minds even when toes felt like popsicles. Outside, the snow drifted in great gentle mounds, smoothing the world into one vast glittering silence. Inside, a candle burned low, and someone began to hum an old tune. The sort of tune no one really remembers learning, but everyone seems to know. And somewhere beneath the wooden beams and wool blankets, a family quietly drifted to sleep, warming each other with shared breath and dreams of thaw. Just beyond the gentle hum of sleep, another part of winter life waited, softer than struggle, stronger than snow. As night settled over the frostbitten clearing, the scent of birch smoke wound its way through the logs of every cabin, seeping into the seams of homes and dreams alike. Winter in early settlements had a peculiar way of drawing everyone inward, not just toward fire and kin, but into the curious corners of themselves, into a kind of hibernation of the spirit. And yet, survival never quite took a day off, even during the quietest hours of snowfall. Beds creaked with the sound of bundled limbs twisting under woolen blankets, while outside, a salted deer hide flapped on the drying rack like a sleepy flag. One of the more delicate arts of wintertime sustenance, aside from the high-stakes gamble of not getting scurvy, was food preservation. That is to say, making things last long enough for spring without turning them into new life forms entirely. It was a season of salted meat, pickled everything, and dried things that were neither entirely dead nor quite delicious. Cabins in the dead of January smelled of smoked fish, slowly aging apples, hopeful turnips, and the faintest, lingering suggestion of desperation. Take, for instance, the saga of the root cellar, a dirt-chilled sanctuary dug out beneath the floorboards or into hillsides, depending on one's architectural ambitions and the number of neighbours with shovels. It was cool in summer and near freezing in winter, the perfect setting for onions to contemplate their existence and potatoes to occasionally sprout ambitions. Inventiveness was often less about luxury and more about, how do we not starve this week, Mildred? And so, the good settlers turned preservation into a noble act of kitchen science. They cured, dried, rendered, and stored with the seriousness of monks transcribing ancient texts. Slabs of venison were smoked slowly over 7 or even 10 days, kissed by hickory wood and mild anxiety. Leftover bear fat, discovered quite impressively to last longer than most friendships, was rendered into tallow and stored in small wooden pots, emerging later as emergency lamp fuel, baking ingredient, or skincare solution, sometimes all at once. And it must be said, a well-stocked larder in the throes of winter was considered not only a feat of forethought, but a kind of domestic sorcery. Visitors would remark on a neighbour's hearty supply the way we comment on someone's sourdough starter today. Oh, you still have dried apples? How cultured. And yet, even with the most valiant efforts, midwinter was when things began to vanish from the shelves. Salt pork slices got thinner by the day. Hardtack was chipped like granite and soaked in whatever hot liquid could be produced. And butter became a luxury so rare it was practically currency. The yolk-hued gold in a world gone white. There are documented instances, mostly murmured through centuries of diary entries, where items were bartered in the most curious of ways. One winter in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a neighbour reportedly traded a pair of hand-knit mittens for a half jar of pickled beets. The mittens were described as only slightly damp, and the beets of excellent resolve. Of course, sometimes preservation failed. Jars cracked in the freeze. Mice chewed through twine seals. Lazy root vegetables turned to mush. Despair, like frost, has a way of spreading from the feet upward. Yet even then, the settlers pressed on, boiling dubious onions and stirring questionable stews, with the determination of people whose plans to move somewhere warmer had fallen through. Again, in those frozen kitchens, huddled over iron kettles and flanked by pewter spoons, families passed around tails and teaspoons of whatever was left. It was in those moments that necessity played host to creativity. Recipes were born not from abundance, but absence. Winter pie, snow bread, if it grows it goes stew. And you can imagine the pride when whatever emerged from the hearth was not only edible, but possibly even tasty. By candlelight, with the soft rasp of wind weaving through pine and thatch, the settlers said their good nights, not in words always, but in the quiet ritual of clearing plates, banking the fire, and running one last hand along the frost-lined window. The snow continued softly outside, unbothered and endless. And through that hush, as the hearth dimmed to coals and dreams turned to soup recipes, we now inch, ever so gently, toward the coldest hours of the night, when even silence wears a shawl. And yet, the tiniest flickers of warmth can still be found, curled beside a story, an ember, or perhaps an old wooden oil lantern that still works, if you know how to light it. By late afternoon, winter had taken on that silvery hush once again. Snow muffled every sound, cloaking the crunch of footsteps and forcing the landscape into a strange, reverent silence, as if the trees themselves had paused mid-sentence. Inside a modest log cabin, glowing with the soft flicker of a hearth flame, a settler named Margaret Orville was attempting to keep pudding from becoming a small kitchen tragedy. Winter cooking in the colonies was not for the faint of heart. or week of molar. Everything was boiled, sometimes twice, and most dishes could double as construction material in a pinch. Margaret, like so many settler women, was a one-woman survival system. She remembered recipes by heart, mostly because no paper could survive the humidity of summer or the dryness of winter. This particular dish, plum pudding, though no plums were involved and had not been since the king still had all his teeth, was a traditional fare meant to cheer up a family slogging through the monochrome months of snow. Outside, Jack Orville, her husband, was attempting what 18th century men referred to bravely as chosen wood. In reality, this involved fighting frozen branches with a dull axe and a lot of personal dignity. Wood gathering was a daily task, and no chore was likely to induce more grumbling among grown men in a settler village. Why? Because wood was wet, tools were blunt, and snow managed to go places snow was never meant to go, like into boots or under collars, or occasionally into the soul. It's easy to romanticize these winters, with their icicle-laced eaves and syrup-thick quiet. But let's be honest, they were less Little House on the Prairie and more Little Freezer on the Tundra. Candles were another lifeline and another chore. The Orvilles, like most families, made their own from tallow, rendered animal fat, which, once cooled, smelled only faintly of last week's stew and the inevitability of gout. Every few days, the tedious ritual of candle dipping commenced, a simple but time-consuming process that involved repeatedly dipping a string into fat and waiting for it to cool again and again. Often, while children asked irritatingly helpful questions like, "Is it done yet?" It wasn't. As twilight neared, the family huddled together, wearing nearly everything they owned. Layering was critical, mostly because firefighting was not yet a thing, and more than one family had accidentally turned their frosted cabin into New Year's Eve fireworks by placing outer garments too close to the blaze. One learned not so much through education as singed experience. Dinner, when it came, was modest. A mass of root vegetables boiled to the brink of despair, a bit of salt pork, and the much-lauded pudding, which had successfully congealed into something nearly edible. Conversation was quiet, lullabied by the fire's crackle and the gusty moans of wind slipping between shutter slats. Margaret recited psalms as she mended mittens by firelight. The children dozed under patchwork quilts, their dreams surely more exciting than their dinner. Jack, grunting a satisfied approval of his pudding, part faith, part jaw strength, leaned back in his chair, still wearing his boots. A man did not remove his footwear in winter, unless he was serenely confident that his toes would still be attached in the morning. And then came the least favorite chore of all, those necessary midnight excursions outside. Because one fiery rule of frontier winters was this: if you didn't empty the chamber pot, you'd regret it in profound and almost existential ways. Wrapped in a cloak that smelled faintly of lamp oil, Jack trudged outside into the moon-bitten snow. The stars glinted, audacious and diamond cold in the sky. Constellations mocked him with their eternal indifference. He dumped the pot with elegant brevity and returned, sneezing ice crystals from his beard. The door shut. The latch clicked. The fire sighed, and for a few moments, silence ruled once more. In that deep and velvety quiet, the kind that only snow can command, Margaret sat still, watching the flames dance their slow, smoky ballet. In the quiet warmth, she knew that survival in a winter like this wasn't about heroism. It was about stubbornness mostly, mixed with a teaspoon of humor, several quarts of habit, and a firm belief that spring would eventually show up, and not empty-handed. Outside, the wind sang low over the hills, and inside the family slipped into slumber, cradled by logs, wool, and the steady beat of borrowed time. And far beyond that little cabin, farther still into the darkness of the woods, a new sound edged into the night. A sled blade whispering over packed snow, carrying trade, messages, or something else entirely. As the snow deepened and the hearth fires cracked with gentle stubbornness, the most remarkable transformation in the settlement wasn't in the weather or the earth. It was in the wool and the hands that spun it. Winter, for all its icy tyranny, had a curious way of turning ordinary chores into acts of quiet heroism, and none more so than the silent seated contest between woman and wheel, or man and spindle, that unfolded beside flickering flames. Spinning wool wasn't simply a practical matter of staying warm. It was, arguably, the cold season's most refined performance art, only slightly less competitive than who could make the least lumpy porridge. Look closely, and you'd see fingers nimble with familiarity, twisting loose wool fibers into tight, hardy threads meant for everything from socks to underpants, provided you were rich enough to dream of separate undergarments. For the common settler, it might all come together in something affectionately called wool things, function over fashion, never to be confused with elegance. They were scratchy, they were shapeless, but they were warm. And in winter, warmth trumped aesthetics every time. Back then, a successful pair of woolen mittens could be talked about for days. "Did you see the cuffs on Martha's new pair?" someone might whisper during Sabbath. Such flair, such ribbed commitment. But spinning wasn't merely a task. It was a season-long symphony in minor inconveniences. The wheel needed adjusting, the treadle creaked, the cat tried to nap on the roving, and your youngest child mistook the carding comb for a hat. And don't even ask what happened when someone sneezed near a basket of freshly teased wool. Just don't. Still, the work went on. Not because people loved spinning per se, but because the alternative was death by draft or wearing the same crusty shirt until spring thaw. And well into July. Layering was less a fashion trend, more a survival strategy. Settlers layered everything from woolen stockings to what they called petticoats. Charming, plural, and just cryptic enough to keep future fashion historians guessing. Now, if you wandered into an average settler's home, say a small, smoky room with walls weeping with frost and ceiling beams reclaiming a few snowflakes that had clearly taken a wrong turn, you'd likely find a family wrapped in their own creations, huddled like sheep who had unionized. At the heart of the home, spinning wasn't the only rhythm. There was also the methodical, meditative motion of knitting needles. Click, click, pause, sigh, click. As someone turned yesterday's yarn into today's scarf, or floor sock, boot tube, outdoor purposeful neck rectangle. They had many names and few shapes, and every one of them was a love letter in wool, scribbled in knots and warmth. And when one finished a garment, even a slightly lopsided mitten or a scarf that leaned aggressively left, there was a kind of celebration. A quiet, practical celebration. It was simply worn. Sometimes immediately, sometimes still damp. Because if time was wool, no one was spinning extra. For children, woolen attire could feel like a sentence. Bundled in layer after layer, their silhouettes grew spherical. Running was discouraged by physics. When a child fell, it was less a tumble and more a controlled, muffled descent into fluff. There were tales of a little boy in one village who went down in the snow and only emerged when the spring sun finally melted enough of his surroundings. He claimed he had been fine the entire time, and warmer than usual. But the magic of spinning and knitting wasn't just in the result. It lay in the ritual. The way families came together around the fire, hands busy, voices quiet. Old tales were shared, some true, some wildly aspirational, and the room filled with the slow, invisible alchemy of survival and storytelling. In those dimly lit rooms, history was woven one twist at a time. Threads that might have looked unremarkable, even dull, held lives inside them. A grandfather's elbow patch, a sibling's hand-me-down, a mother's scarf wrapped thrice around a child's cold cheeks. The wool didn't just warm the body, it cradled memory, softened hardship, and fluffed the harsh corners of a bitter season. And as the long night pressed against frost-paned windows, and the spinning wheel slowed to a gentle end, one could almost believe that if you spun thick enough, knitted long enough, and believed warmly enough, you could keep the cold at bay, just for one more day. Somewhere beyond the flicker of the firelight, a new kind of work awaited. Less wool, more smoke, but just as vital in the wintry rhythm of survival. As winter deepened its hold over the early settlements, something peculiar crept into the daily lives of those hardy souls scraping an existence from the frostbitten earth. Winter fashion. Now, to the modern mind, fashion might conjure visions of tailoring, trends, and tasteful layering. To a colonial settler in 1692, it mostly meant, is it dead yet? Good. Sew it around your feet. Practicality was the reigning monarch of the wardrobe. Before the advent of central heating or even a basic understanding of the phrase hypothermia, people dressed in layers so excessive they seemed less human and more animated haystacks with ambitions. Women draped themselves in woolen petticoats stacked like pastry layers under woolen gowns. Men favoured breeches, waistcoats, and greatcoats heavy enough to sink a canoe. Everyone shared one principal accessory: relentless draftiness. Now fur was the gold standard of warmth. Fox, raccoon, beaver. If it roamed and had a heat-retaining hide, it probably ended up as part of someone's outerwear. Beaver pelts, for example, were so highly prized that they became an actual currency in the fur trade. Imagine paying your rent with a hat. Fast forward 300 years, and we now judge people harshly for wearing the same. Inside homes, settlers wore caps nearly constantly, including while they slept. Yes, the iconic nightcap wasn't just a Dickensian flourish, it was a life necessity. The average log or timber-framed home had about the same insulation efficiency as a colander. So unless you fancied an ear snapping off in your sleep, you donned a snug little woolen bonnet. Imagine the cuddliest thing your grandmother ever knitted. Now picture it with fewer colours and more lice. The fashion choices of children weren't terribly different. They simply wore miniature versions of adult clothes. Toddlers stumbled about like pint-sized judges, swaddled in cloaks and awkward waistcoats, tripping over their own gaiters as they collected firewood. Infant fashion, meanwhile, leaned firmly toward the category of please don't freeze. Babies were bundled in so many cloth layers, they resembled small loaves of bread, left by the hearth to warm, rotate, and possibly rise. Personal hygiene during winter was, let's say, creatively timed. Bathing, already a chilly prospect in the best of seasons, became dangerously cold. If the nearest water source had recently turned solid, settlers had two choices: chop through the ice and risk pneumonia, or embrace the scent of survival. Most opted for the latter, dabbing themselves with vinegar or herbs and declaring, good enough. Winter might have taken their toes, but at least they still had dignity. Sort of. Wool was the undisputed hero of the season. Homespun, hand-carded, and hand-woven. it was an itchy miracle of resilience. A single woolen shirt, passed down through generations, could outlive most family members. It absorbed moisture, trapped heat, and had the general texture of sandpaper in a thunderstorm. Still, it was warm, and warmth was worth every scratch. Of course, there were always surprises. Fashion, even then, couldn't fully yield to practicality. Lace collars occasionally made an appearance, even if frozen stiff and crumbling by midday. Some people embroidered their mittens. A splash of coloured ribbon peeked from beneath the oppressive grey of woolen cloaks. These little indulgences whispered something important. Even deep within an unforgiving wilderness, humans still carried an instinct to adorn, to beautify, to feel something akin to pride, or in some cases, scandalized by symmetry. Shoes posed another adventure. Leather stiffened in the cold like week-old porridge, so many turned to moccasins, an indigenous innovation far superior in both warmth and flexibility. Settlers who could barter or learn to make them did so eagerly, though grudgingly. Why admit the people you were trying to convert had better fashion sense than you? As nightfall approached and wind howled through pine and clapboard alike, families adjusted their layers by firelight. Children were tucked into bed still in their clothes, sometimes even their coats, depending on how insistent the wind was. Mothers mended socks that had more holes than wool. Fathers ran awkward figures in snow to stamp life into numb boots. In every humble home, survival was staged like a play with precise costumes, a blend of animal, scholar, and frost-dodging acrobat. And under all those layers, wool, fur, flax, and linen, settlers dreamed, perhaps, of warmer places. Maybe whispered stories of Spanish, islands they'd never seen, or tales of springtime that felt too far off to believe. But until then, they'd wrap themselves tighter, stand prouder in their patchworked armor, and march bravely into yet another dawn of bone-crackling cold. Soon, even the most draft-ridden corridor of their world would tremble with the scent of something else. Food, however modest, prepared in the shadows of ice and necessity. While February laid its flimsy promise of spring a little closer on the horizon, the reality of the settlement's daily grind continued to crunch beneath frosted boots like week-old snow. In these early colonial outposts, luxury was defined not by satin breeches or candelabras, but by the unburnt ends of candles, a dry pair of stockings, and the rare, blessed moment when the axe was sharp enough to split wood without insulting your ancestors. Inside cabins clenched tight against the cold, daily survival mingled with the absurdities of human stubbornness. For instance, in one plucky Massachusetts Bay homestead, a dispute arose over whether chickens should be invited indoors during snow squalls. Mrs. Halcombe insisted that they would freeze to death otherwise. Mr. Halcombe argued they tracked manure across his best and only rug. The chicken, incidentally, remained neutral and roosted atop the family spinning wheel, further complicating textile production. But not all was debate and droppings. The settling of these frozen lands brought out a peculiar form of ingenuity born of boredom, desperation, and a touch too much salted pork. Pioneer children, for example, discovered that by bending birch saplings and strapping themselves to barrel staves, they could fashion a sort of proto-sled. It was thrilling until someone's knee went backwards and the local healer, who believed fervently in the restorative power of goose grease, had to be summoned. Ah yes, the early colonial healer, or at least the spiritual cousin of modern medicine's worth a try attitude. Armed with poultices, pungent herbs, and unwavering confidence, these brave souls stitched, salved, and sucked the poison out of nearly everything short of heartbreak. And heartbreak did come, in quiet moments by the hearth, when letters from home arrived soaked in tears and old wax, or didn't arrive at all. Letters were, in the absence of phones, texts, or overly dramatic Facebook statuses, the lifeline of emotional survival. When ships could dock, the community gathered with the jittery hope of news from across the Atlantic. Men who hadn't cried since their childhood goat died found themselves misty-eyed at the signature of a distant brother with good penmanship. Women clutched dear the paper upon which their sister's hand had once touched. Lit by firelight and read aloud a dozen times, the words within these letters pulsed with warmth no fur blanket could rival. Beyond letters and chickens, there was music, or, at the very least, something. People insisted was music. In the frosted evenings, when the logs hissed in protest and every wooden surface creaked like it had secrets, neighbors gathered in drafty cabins with fiddles, flutes, and makeshift drums that once stored pickled vegetables. Fiddling was folk therapy, a defiance of the cold wrapped in rhythm. Some danced, others foot-tapped subtly, lest they spill precious goose-fat tea. Even spiritual life was weathered by winter. Honoring the Sabbath with frozen toes and snow-filled bonnets proved a unique flavor of piety. Churches, bless their drafty walls, served as both sanctuaries and test kitchens for communal body heat. Ministers spoke solemn truths, punctuated by the occasional sneeze or the sound of someone discreetly gnawing on a pocket biscuit to stave off fainting. And of course, there were the stories told round the fire. Wobbly-lipped tales of wolves with eyes like lanterns, of lost patrols and ghostly deer that vanished into snow squalls like dreams. These bedtime legends, half true and half frozen fiction, wound their way into young minds, who then stared wide-eyed into the flickering shadows and vowed either to become heroes or at least make it through school without frostbite. As the ice on the river moaned under its glassy burden and smoke curled from chimneys like question marks, those in the settlement tucked their feet into straw-filled bedding sacks and listened to the wind barging rudely into every crack. It was a time when survival was measured not in grand gestures, but in the comfort of hot stew, a shared laugh, and knowing no one had frozen into the privy. And so, the long season lingered, but with each passing day, a thimble more light returned. Snow dripped from cabin roofs with the lazy rhythm of end-of-season weariness. The settlers waited, slept, stirred. As a new sun began to cast its thin golden net across the brittle ground, they awoke, not only to another day, but to a task as vital as chopping wood or mending mittens, preparing cautiously for the hush and hope of thaw. By late winter, when even the icicles seemed bored of hanging around, early settlers teetered on the edge of their own frosty marathons. The snow, once charming and pristine in December, had by February turned into a relentless white crust that crackled underfoot like stale bread. Everything creaked, doors, knees, neighbors, especially neighbors. The firewood piles, once stacked tall like fortress walls against the cold, now slouched pitifully, reduced to a few half-frozen logs and one curiously singed fence post no one wanted to admit to repurposing. The root cellar became a cathedral of compromise. One shriveled turnip, a jar of pickled something no one could quite identify, and a cabbage that had possibly gained sentience. And still, they carried on. In the dim glow of the fire, families shared stories, half memories, half legends, occasionally sprinkled with things that were probably just dreams someone once had during sleep deprivation and declared canon. Aunt Edna vividly recalled the winter the chickens tried to roost atop the chimney for warmth. They were rescued, only mildly roasted. The youngest child swore he'd heard a bear whispering outside the door, and given how long they'd been on dwindling rations, no one entirely dismissed it. Meal preparation had become a strangely philosophical exercise. What do we become, they wondered, when porridge is both breakfast and dinner, and almost soup if you wait long enough? Bread was now occasionally just the crust that survived being too close to the hearth, and were noble enough to become toast. Even salt was rationed like treasure, stored in cracked clay pots and sprinkled stingily, as if seasoning were a magic spell with limited uses. Yet somehow there lingered a strange comfort in routine. They wore their resilience like slightly damp winter layers, itchy, awkward, and essential. Laundry, for example, achieved the rare paradox of being both tedious and terrifying. In warmer months, it had merely involved hauling buckets, scrubbing, wringing, and a sturdy bag. But in winter, it morphed into an Arctic obstacle course. Water froze mid-pour. Shirts became icy sculptures before they made it to the line. It wasn't unusual to see trousers standing upright like ghosts waiting for their own seance. Bathing, that fabled ritual of cleanliness, was scheduled with such ceremony that it bordered on religious. A heated kettle invited to a wooden tub, cautiously tested as though it might bite. Families often bathed in sequence, starting with the baby, who mostly screamed in protest, and ending with the eldest, by which point the water had taken on the hue of melancholy stew. Still, it was warm-ish, and in the end, they all emerged a little cleaner and deeply suspicious of each other's timing. Outside, the wind was a persistent poet. It whispered across the frozen fields, weaving around, chimneys, rattling shutters like an old librarian demanding quiet. Snowdrifts rose like the slow exhalations of the earth, covering fences, paths, and regrets. The landscape took on a hush so complete, it made every crunch of a boot feel impolite. But amid the harsh white silence, life clung on, not loudly, but firmly. Children adapted with the genius of the board. They invented games, knock the icicle, catch the draft, and snowball ambush the goat. Tools turned into toys, and chores blurred with competition. Winters were hard, yes, but also wondrously soft in memory, like a blanket made of shared struggle and slightly moldy butterscotch. Community was more than ever a lifeline. A shared stew pot, a borrowed coat, a joke repeated until it became culturally significant. The settlers learned quickly that even the harshest snow couldn't mute the warmth of humanity. Though the neighbor who played the fiddle at full volume every night did test that theory considerably. And so, late winter crawled its way toward reluctant spring. The days teased slightly longer light. The roof's icicles blinked with slow drips. And in some windowsills, dreams bloomed, not daring things, just quiet marvels. A seed saved, a plan whispered, socks not freezing overnight. Outside, a crow perched on a fence post, its silhouette crisp against the pale sky, as if watching for the first sign of thaw. Inside, firelight flickered, casting shadows that looked almost like movement, almost like a little more life returning. Tomorrow, they would rise, wrap themselves in everything they owned, and turn again to the rhythm of surviving. But tonight, the house was still. The stories had been told, and the long sleep of winter wrapped around each soul like a soft quilt edged in frost. And just beyond the edge of snowfall, something else waited, something just as ancient and just as cold. Every breath sighed in the stillness of early dawn was a soft puff of frost, echoes of a world not yet warmed by fire or sun. Snow clung lazily to the eaves of timber homes, and icicles hung like nature's own chandeliers, shimmering with a kind of quiet vanity. In this final hush of the long, relentless winter, the settlers moved about like clockwork ghosts wrapped in wool, layering routine over survival like bedquilts over weary limbs. By March's end, the snow, though still proud and thick, softened under the lengthening light. A hopeful sort of sludge began pooling along footpaths, and boots, stitched together with thread and several whispered prayers, became heavy with thaw water. The sun, in its low-hanging gold, hadn't quite remembered how to behave like summer, but it lingered longer, peeking between the branches like a bashful guest overstaying their welcome. Indoor life, which had once been bustling with chopping, sewing, and the occasional ox chase that ended catastrophically in the pantry, slowed into something softer, with the food stores perilously low, beans blushing with frost and flour growing increasingly philosophical. The settlers practiced that old art, making do. Lentils became stew, stale bread became pudding if you squinted, and whatever mystery dried meat had been found at the bottom of the barrel became Tuesday's surprise. No one asked questions, especially not about Tuesday. Fires still roared in hearths, though now more from habit than necessity. Children sat wrapped in hand-me-down furs, each one resembling a particularly pensive raccoon. They listened to stories passed down from grandparents who claimed, with suspicious certainty, that the blizzard of '95, pick any 1695, they didn't specify, had frozen soup mid-air. In the evenings, candles flickered with less defiance. Tallow was sparse, and darkness was cheaper. Families huddled together, all sharp elbows and sleepy limbs, reading aloud from whichever book hadn't yet been used to plug a draft. The Bible, of course, but also old almanacs and travel journals from adventurers who dared write sentences like, "We crossed the Andes with nothing but dried figs and sheer optimism," as though that were a reasonable thing to do. And the animals, those unsung roommates of survival, began to stretch their limbs again. The chickens, grimly underproducing since December, now made hesitant clucks of encouragement. The cow, who had weathered months in a makeshift stable that doubled as communal therapy space, began producing milk again, somewhat out of pity. The goat, as always, plotted. There were moments, brief ones, when someone might look out past the tree line into the whiteness now marbled with exposed dirt and twitching roots, and feel something unnameable humming. Not quite hope, because hope felt dramatic and prone to poetry, but more like reluctant optimism, the kind that knits together the ragged months and says, "Let's try this madness again next year." By the end of winter, the settlers weren't simply survivors. They were reluctant enthusiasts of the absurd. They had learned to stack split logs like art, to patch their boots with everything from bark to domestic regret, and to trust that spring, like an unreliable uncle, did show up eventually, just fashionably late. And so came that treasured ritual, the uncovering. Snow retreated like a shy performer leaving stage left. Tools lost in November were rediscovered with mild celebrations. "Ah, there's the shovel. I knew I hadn't fed it to the pig." Tiny shoots poked defiant green heads through the muck, and the air, once brittle and white with cold, now smelled faintly of earth, wet wool, and profound relief. They began to speak in terms of in-betweens, between thaw and hunger, between darkness and light, between the silence of winter and the racket of planting season. Soon, they would trade in wool for linen, soup for salad, and candlelit tales for long days in the field muttering at vegetables. But not just yet. There would be one more slow evening. One more warm fire drowsily emboldened. One more cup of birch bark tea held in grateful hands that remembered the cold too well. Through the drafty walls and creaking beams, the night would settle gently, no longer something to fear but to nestle into, like the final page of a long, strange tale told by those who dared to live it. So now, dear dreamer of powdered streets and woolen nights, close your eyes with a slow, content breath. You've made it through the winter. Let the snow fall quietly now. You've earned your rest.